curtains and covering. Let's go ahead and get into this, or we will be here all night. When we speak of the curtains and coverings, we're really talking about the roof and the ceiling of the tabernacle. A person that's approaching the tabernacle from the outside would see the outer covering, and that's why we've listed it first. It's what you're going to see first, the first covering. And as mentioned earlier, the outer covering was made of what's called badger skins, and the Hebrew word is tahash. And we don't really know what the badger is. In the Sinai Peninsula, we're certain that it was different than the badger we know here in the West. And it's been suggested, even translated by different scholars in some of the Bibles that you have, as dolphin or as sea cow. And we talked about the improbability of that based on the fact that it was considered unclean. And it just doesn't seem likely to me that God would allow his holiest of holy places to be covered by something that was unclean. Yes, Woody? Could have been, but I really don't think so. See, the whole plan, we'll see as we get into it, but the whole plan was to provide a way for people to be able to go in there. They didn't get to, except for the high priest, they didn't get to in the tabernacle. But ultimately, we're going to see that Jesus provided a way for us to go right into the throne room of God. And okay, so we do find one other use of badger skins, and it is found in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 10. And it's a message from God to the children of Israel, and he sent this message through Ezekiel. And he said, I clothed you in embroidered cloth and gave you sandals of badger, and it's that same word, tahash, skin. I clothed you with fine linen and covered you with silk. And while we, may not know exactly what kind of animal he was talking about, what kind of leather, we're pretty sure it was leather of some kind. When you think of shoes, you think of leather. Even I've got a pair of handmade moccasins at home that are made out of doe skin, that a lady made for me once. And so leather tends to be what you use for shoes. Nowadays we use rubber and synthetics and stuff like that, but it must have been able to keep out the rain and the weather, and that's another thing that Miriam and I were talking about. Because the Bible doesn't talk about them treating it any way special for waterproofing or anything like that. Now, we're talking about the covering now, the outside covering, the one that you could see when you approach the tabernacle. And it was most likely used for its functionality and not for its beauty. And no doubt as time went on, here's this hide it's got to be pretty big if you think about the size of the tabernacle. But this hide is out there in the weather, in the rain, and the wind, and the sun, and this thing is just getting more tanned and more tanned. And so it probably was going to be pretty unattractive. At least you wouldn't look at that and go, oh man, isn't that nice, It's just going to be an ugly old, like covering it with an old tarp or something, basically. And what a perfect picture of Jesus. Isaiah said in Isaiah 53, verses 2 through 4, that he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness. And when we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne all our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. So I get a mental image of this tarpaulin, leather tarpaulin that he had over this thing as just being just an ugly old weather-beaten cover, and nothing really fancy. In the first place, there was nothing really flashy or fancy or attractive about Jesus. We know he didn't stand out in the crowd, because when the chief priest came to arrest him, Judas had to identify him. They couldn't tell him from anybody else, And so, not only that, but taking on the abuse of the cross, beaten to the point where, even his own disciples didn't recognize him when he presented himself to them. And no doubt God directed Moses to use this outer skin to send us a message that we're not to judge according to the outward appearance. And that's a theme in the Bible. When God chose David as king and Samuel went down to anoint him, he looked at all those, and he's bound to have said, Lord, you can't possibly mean this little scrawny runt. And God's like, hey, don't, or Samuel says, hey, God doesn't look on the outward appearance, but he judges on the heart. And so Jesus tells us in John chapter 7, verse 24, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. John 7:24. The second covering, the one just under the outer covering, was made of ram skins dyed red. Now the ram is the animal that God chose for substitution. The first time we see this is in Genesis chapter 22, when God was testing Abraham. And it says, and it came to pass when, after these things, that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. And we, and get that, he said, we will come back to you. So Abraham, verse 6, took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself. Now, the old King James just says, will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. What an unusual command for God to make. God tells Abraham to take his only son, and he used the term only son. He was the only son of promise, and to offer him as a burnt sacrifice. Now, in the first place, Abraham had another son. His name was Ishmael. And no doubt God referred to Isaac as Abraham's only son to remind Abraham that he had, blown it. That Isaac actually was his only son by Sarah and the only heir to God's promise. Ishmael was Abraham's idea, not God's. Okay. And so God was about to direct Abraham to do something that would greatly test his faith in God. And he likely wanted to remind Abraham of the importance of being obedient. And trusting God rather than taking matters into our own hands. One really comforting thing about this passage is that God, even when we mess up things by getting in the flesh and not being obedient to God, even when we mess things up, God can still accomplish what he sets out to do. So the thing is, if we won't work with him, then God will do it in spite of us. Somebody said once that, well, if we don't do what God tells us to do, he can't get it done. Yes, he can. We just won't get to be a part of it. We'll miss the blessing, because it is a blessing to be obedient to the Lord. The sad thing is that sin does have inherent penalties. And even though God will forgive us and somehow cause it all to work together to the good, for them that love God and are called according to his purpose, we often miss out on that great blessing that comes along with being a part of what God is doing in our family, in our own life, in our community, in our city, and in our world. And the thing is, we not only miss out on the blessing, often we have to live with the consequences of the sin, the consequences of disobedience. God was saying to Abraham, this should have been your only son. If you'd have done it the way that I told you to do it. And everything that God does in our life is to point the world to his son, to our Savior. Well, Abraham had learned his lesson, and when God tells him to take his son and go up to the land of Moriah, we see that Abraham complies. And he was confident. I love that he didn't say, hopefully we'll come back or I'll come back. He said, we'll come back to you. He knew that God had given him a promise, and that promise involved Isaac's offspring. And so he knew that God was going to make a way. Even if he killed him, he knew that God was able to bring him back to life. And man, that's so hard sometimes when we don't, because we can't see the end from the beginning like God can. And sometimes if we could, it would